Before we start,
I'd like to call to order the April 4th, 2023 meeting of the Cloverdale Planning Commission to order at 6 o'clock. If you could all please arise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, I'll lead that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Great, thanks. Mr. Clerk, can I please have a roll call?
definitely, thank you, Chair. Let the record reflect that all commissioners are present with the exception of Commissioner Sanders.
Do any commissioners have any conflicts of interest for any items listed on tonight's agenda? Seeing none. Staff, are there any changes or deletions to the agenda this evening?
No changes, Chair.
Thank you. Let's move to public comment. Any person wishing to speak to the Planning Commission on any item not listed on the agenda may do so at this time pursuant to the Brown Act. The Commission is not allowed to consider issues or take action on any item not listed on the agenda. Comments from the public will be allowed on all agenda items at this time. At the time that each item is called, in-person commenters may fill out a speaker card before they have spoken. Please submit this to the city clerk for a record. And if you're watching on a device through Zoom, use your raise hand feature. If listening from a phone, dial *9 to raise your hand, and the city clerk will prompt you when it's your turn to speak. 3 minutes are allotted to each speaker. With that, I'll officially open this to public comment period.
Thank you, Chair. It doesn't look like anyone is raising their hand here in the public or online.
Okay, seeing no hands raised, I close the public comment period. Communication. The Commission may discuss at this time any written communication sent to the Commissioners since the last Commission meeting. Are there any items from the Commission that they'd like to address from communications?
Chair, we have not received any communications.
Perfect. I'll close that section. We'll go on to the consent calendar. All items under the consent calendar will be considered together as one action of the City Commission unless any commissioner or member of the public requests an item to be removed and considered separately. Would any member of the Commission or public like to move an item from the consent calendar? Look for any public comment on the consent calendar.
Thank you, Chair. No one is raising their hand in the public or online at this time.
Perfect. Can I get a motion for the consent calendar? Motion by Commissioner Wege. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Commissioner Hovitz. Can I get a roll call vote?
Second, sorry, Chair. All right, we'll go ahead with Commissioner Spengler,
Aye.
Commissioner Wege, Commissioner Carney, Vice Chair Hoverts,
Aye.
Chair Acey,
Aye.
and then Chair, if we can divert back to item D for the chair and vice chair elections.
Oh, great.
Sorry, it's not on the script.
True. We'll move on to the chair and vice chair elections. First is the selection of the chair. Are there any nominations for anyone to become chair of the Planning Commission for the City of Cloverdale for 2023? we could also nominate Eric, right, since he's absent.
I see he's checked in.
Yes, we spoke with Commissioner Sanders, and he said he is willing to accept any nominations for chair or vice chair, though he's not able to vote. He's not present, but he did mention that he will accept a nomination. And reminder, you are also able to nominate yourself.
I'd like to make a motion to nominate Chair AC.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a first and a second. Any others?
Any other nominations?
Do you accept the nomination?
I will if there's no other nominations. Otherwise, I wouldn't mind sharing the wealth. Seeing none, can I get a roll call vote?
Definitely. All right, so for the selection of Chair AC to continue as the chair, Commissioner Spengler,
Aye.
Commissioner Weggie,
Aye.
Commissioner Carney,
Aye.
Vice Chair Hoverts,
Aye.
and Chair AC.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Now we'll move on to the selection of the vice chair. Are there any nominations for a vice chair?
I nominate current Vice Chair Huberts, since we didn't really have many meetings this last term, so I think it's.
I'll second it.
I'll third it.
Do you accept?
At this time, I would like to pass that on. I would like to make a motion for Eric Sanders as Vice Chair.
I'll second that as well.
All right, so that motion, because there was an agreement, we'll go ahead and, for the nomination, we have a new motion, a new second for Commissioner Sanders, who did tell us that he would accept a nomination. With that, Commissioner Spengler,
Aye.
Commissioner Weggie,
Commissioner Sanders becoming
Commissioner
vice
Sanders
chair.
for vice chair,
Aye.
Commissioner Carney,
Aye.
Vice Chair Hoverts,
Aye.
and Chair AC.
Aye.
All right. With that, Commissioner Sanders will become the new vice chair, and Commissioner AC will remain the chair
For one more year.
for one more year.
That's it.
Hopefully it's more than 5
Then we changed. I already messed up once and skipped one to the consent calendar. Moving on to public hearings. Officially open to public hearing. In-person commenters may fill out the speaker card before they have spoken. Anyone watching on a device may use the raise hand feature of the *9 if you're calling from a phone. Are any members of the public online or person wishing to make a public comment? There's not a public hearing.
Yeah, I can start introducing the item, Chair, if that's okay.
Perfect. Let's move on.
So this is the housing element. We've been talking about this for a couple of years now, and we have Luke Lindenbush from Four Leaf Consulting, who's our consultant, who's been doing just a really great job on getting the housing element together. And Jane Riley, I think, is online, and she's also works with Luke, and they've been our consultants. So he has a PowerPoint. At the end, we're going to ask you to consider a resolution recommending approval of the housing element to the City Council. And we're planning to take that as soon as possible if you elect to pass the resolution. So Luke, I don't know if you want to just go through and maybe if you have questions along the way, if you don't mind, if they just interrupt you as you go, if that's the case, and then we can just have a discussion. Again, we did have this before the Planning Commission. I don't know about, I think you have a slide that indicates when, but we're asking real specific questions about what policies you'd like to see in there, and those are captured in this current draft. So we did a lot of work before at the council and the Planning Commission. This is kind of the result of that, and we're looking to submit it to the state for approval. So Luke, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin, for the introduction, and good evening, members of the Planning Commission. It's great to be here with you this evening at the culmination of this effort that's been about the last year and a half. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Luke Lindenbush. I'm a housing policy planner with Four Leaf, your housing element consultants. We've been handling every aspect of the project, from housing element preparation, community outreach, and development of CEQA as well. And I am joined tonight by my colleague Jane Riley, who's the Director of Housing Policy with Four Leaf. So next slide, please. So moving through the presentation today, first just be giving a background of the timeline, how we got here, and then going into some of the key portions of the housing element, the housing strategy, those are the goals, policies, and programs as well. In addition to the sites inventory, a key portion of the housing element process, determining where you're going to fulfill your regional housing needs allocation throughout and have housing sites to fulfill that obligation throughout the city. And then finally, just going into next steps, where we're at after Planning Commission recommends adoption to the City Council, who adopts it, where it will then be sent to HCD for final certification. Slide. So looking at the timeline, we had a huge amount of background research that went into this document, as you can see by the size of the packet, and held a kickoff workshop in winter of 2021, where we looked at sort of what has changed in this housing element cycle since the last time. They're 8-year cycles. And as you know, there's a lot of housing law, not just with the housing element law, but just with housing in general that has changed over the last 8 years that needed to be incorporated into this document. After that kickoff workshop, we had a presentation seeking input on really the big questions of how do we want to frame the sites inventory strategy? How did we want to approach the goals, policies, and programs? That's really the meat of the document that's in front of you today. And then after that, we came back with a workshop last May, looking at the refined draft housing strategy, which included those goals, policies, and programs, and sites as well. After that, and after an extensive amount of outreach that occurred in the spring and summer of last year, the draft housing element was circulated for a required 30 days from October to November, where we received public comment on the document before submitting it to HCD for the initial draft of their review. HCD then had 90 days to review the document from December to March. And in the last 7 days, they gave us some informal comments. We submitted a revised draft that was released for 7 days and that was able to be incorporated in advance of this adoption draft that's in front of you tonight. And now we've received a formal letter on March 9th with HCD's official comments. We were grateful that relative to other jurisdictions, this letter was pretty short and there weren't any big surprises from anything we were anticipating in terms of the statutory obligations we have to fulfill with HCD. So that brings us to the adoption hearings. This is the first one, which will be followed by an adoption hearing on April 26th, where if the Planning Commission recommends adoption tonight, the City Council will then adopt the document and we'll turn it around to HCD.
And just real quick for the benefit of the new commissioners, because we're diving into this kind of late and it's probably pretty fast and all that, but the housing element is really, it's required by the state that each city put together a housing element every 7 years?
8, yep.
8 years. And in that document, it really sets forth how we're going to meet our housing needs. And I know that's like just basic information, but just so you know, like this is something that the state does require us to do. And getting it certified is an important step because that really opens us up for additional funding. One of the, a lot of the, when people are applying for grants for funding for housing, one of the boxes will be, do they have a certified housing element? So it's pretty important that we have a certified housing element.
Absolutely. Thank you for that background, Kevin. Next slide, please. So really going into the structure of this document, again, especially for the new commissioners, really want to make sure that you're as familiarized as possible with what's in front of you. It is hundreds of pages, so just want to break it down, really. The structure is laid out in the introduction and summary, and a lot of that is drawn from some of the data that we're required to use. Most of this comes from the Census, American Community Survey. That data is included in full in one of your appendices, which is the ABAG Housing Needs Data Packet as well. Section 2 is the housing strategy. Again, that's the goals, policies, and programs. We saw, in comparison to the 5th cycle, which occurred from 2015 to 2023, the city of Cloverdale was largely successful in achieving its housing programs. That's noted in the 2015 Housing Implementation Progress Table in between section 1 and 2 in your document there as well. So really just want to emphasize with the housing strategy that this is a housing element update. We don't want to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and we were starting with a good point. So most of the programs that you see in this housing element are continued. There are some programs that are included as well to respond to statutory requirements from HCD. Changes in state housing law. The code changes program is one of the ones that contains the most program changes we'll go into a little bit later. But really, this is a housing element update, and most of these are continuing with the housing strategy. And the goals themselves were unchanged, which we'll look at in a second as well. Section 3 contains housing sites. We're going to go into the city's RHNA, how the city is meeting its RHNA, its Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and the allocation of sites between pipeline projects that are proposed or in development, ADU projections, and some sites as well. The conclusion is pretty self-explanatory. Technical background report is included as a second separate document in the attachments of the item right now. And those have a handful of different sections. First off being needs and resources. That's really data-driven, looking at what the needs are in the city of Cloverdale, which resources exist on a local, state, and federal level to be able to achieve those. A lot of those include funding programs, things of that nature. Section 4.3 is housing constraints. So constraints are broken down into non-governmental and governmental constraints. Governmental constraints are things like fees, permitting procedures, basically things that the city of Cloverdale has control over that may constrain the development of housing. If something's identified as a major constraint, then there needs to be a program to rectify that. Non-governmental constraints are everything else. That includes physical constraints, fire, flood, earthquake. That also includes issues that are less physical, that are community opposition, things that the local government has less control over, but nevertheless may constrain development in some way. After the constraints section, there's also the affirmatively furthering fair housing section, or AFFH. This is really the largest change in the sixth cycle for housing elements compared to the fifth cycle, because this was previously a federal program. It was instated as a state program in 2019 with AB 686. So this is really the first housing element cycle where this analysis is required within the housing element update. So you'll see that a handful of the new programs are really in response to those AFFH requirements. And that section is pretty extensive and pretty new for the housing element update for those of you who may have been around for the fifth cycle. Finally, there's appendices and supporting materials. As I mentioned, there's the ABAG housing data needs packet that includes a bunch of the different data that goes into the technical background report largely, but the entirety of the housing element, census data, American Community Survey. There's also a full appendix that goes into a summary of the community engagement that occurred over the course of the housing element process, which I'll detail a little bit further. But those are really just the supporting materials that show sort of the work that was done over the last 18 months to produce these larger documents. Next slide, please. So next I want to go into the community engagement, and this is a portion that I'm very excited about. This is one of the largest, aside from affirmatively furthering fair housing, this is one of the largest items that HCD has comments on, for the most part, that is a deficiency in housing elements. AFFH shows up in about 92% of housing element letters, according to analysis that was done by ABAG. Community engagement shows up in about 85% of letters. So we're in the top 15% because we didn't receive any comment about our community engagement, which is a good sign that it was robust, it was responsive, and we made a diligent effort to include all segments of the community. We did that through public workshops, including the ones that I mentioned, the kickoff, the housing strategy, big policy topics, and the session that was looking at how to take care of our sites inventory as well. We kept regular updates to the housing element update website on the city's website, public review drafts, the public review draft itself, the revised draft, the adoption draft, distributed to everybody who is interested in the process in the fifth cycle, everybody who responded to our survey, stakeholders who got engaged in the process. We also had a community housing needs and opportunities survey that around 150 members of the public responded to, really indicating where the greatest needs and opportunities are in Cloverdale. And we did that early in the process and really advertised it through community canvassing. I went to around 1,000 homes in Cloverdale and dropped off little blue cards that you might have received at your house. So that was to encourage people to take the survey really at the very beginning of this process in January of 2022. In addition, we tabled at every day of the Cloverdale Citrus Fair last year, leading into the draft housing strategy process, and spoke with hundreds of residents about the history of Cloverdale, what they saw needs and opportunities being, really the kind of specific community context that was able to make this a local document. A lot of time with the requirements, this can feel like a document that is written for the state, and we really wanted to avoid that. We wanted it to be responsive to community concerns and community requests as well. So that was a good opportunity for us a year ago to really meet with the community. A lot of our work was remote at the beginning, and it was great to have some face-to-face conversations that really helped develop the document. In addition, we reached out directly to stakeholders, housing service providers, housing providers, affordable and market rate, faith-based organizations, and there was Cloverdale representation as well in a regional working group, equity working group that was hosted by the Napa-Sonoma Collaborative, which is a sub-regional effort, technical assistance effort that combines forces with the 16 jurisdictions of both Sonoma and Napa counties, which I also facilitate. So that's the community engagement piece. Again, we're really excited that this is the first housing element I've worked on so far that hasn't had a comment about that, which is a good thing. And we really wanted to make sure to reach out to this community and hopeful that we did so. Next slide, please. So now I'm just really going to go into the housing strategy, the goals, policies, and programs that make up this document. Next slide. So really just looking at the goals. Again, these goals are unchanged from the fifth cycle. And each of the programs are organized under, policies and programs are organized under each of these goals. The first one has to do with conserving and improving the existing housing stock. The second one is providing housing for all economic segments of the community. The third goal has to do with providing housing for people with special needs. This is not necessarily what you might think of in terms of the phrase special needs. It's more general, just any statutory groups that are required to be considered by housing element law as it's been amended over the last 50 years or so. This includes seniors, disabled populations, large families, farm workers, homeless persons, female-headed households. It's really a long list, and all of those are addressed within the needs and resources section of the technical background report. There are programs under Goal 3 as well. Next slide, please. Goal 4 has to do with promoting housing opportunities for all populations. There's some additional programs that have been added under this goal. And Goal 6 it has to do with natural resources and energy conservation and green building technologies. So those are the goals, and moving on from there, we'll go into, next slide, please. Really where the program considerations were coming from. As I mentioned, there's a number of new laws that have been passed by the state legislature in the past 8 years. This includes changes to the housing element process. Those timelines that I had mentioned for HCD review, it used to be 60 days, now it's 90 days. There's noticing requirements for when it needs to go out to the public. So some of those laws just implicated our process itself. But there's a number of laws that we have to contend with when we were making this draft as well. Laws pertaining to streamlining of housing. SB 35 wasn't a thing 8 years ago. Most ADU laws that have permitted ADUs as a by right use in jurisdictions were completely different 8 years ago. So those are all the kind of laws that we work to incorporate into the programs and really make sure that there's a plan for the city of Cloverdale to be in compliance with state housing law as far as we can see at this point. In addition, the programs were defined by input from the public and stakeholders. The complete survey results are available as an appendix following the summary of community input, so you can look at all of the comments that were received from the public there. We really looked through and made sure that if there were programmatic considerations that they were considered, in addition to our conversations with stakeholders as well. Housing development targets influenced the development of programs as well. For the most part, as we'll see in the upcoming slides, the City of Cloverdale's regional housing needs allocation is taken care of for the most part by projects that are planned and in development. But nevertheless, even if you are meeting and exceeding your regional housing needs allocation, HCD is really wanting to make sure that your programs are responsive to ensuring that you're going to meet all your housing development targets, not just the big RHNA number that you have, the total number of units, but developing the units that are more difficult to finance and get built, extremely low income, very low income housing. In addition, as I noted, this is, we put in the update and housing element update, and most of these programs are existing and continuing, really building on the work that has been done in the city of Cloverdale and ensure that it can continue to be successfully implemented in the next 8-year planning cycle. And in addition, as we went to the commission and city council a number of times over the past year and a half, the programs are also responsive to your feedback as well. I'll pause to see if there are any questions just on the programs at this point before we move on.
I'll ask one if
Sure.
commission doesn't. About last year we went over, we didn't go over like, we hit the arena in most categories and went over. Is there any talk about, but I'm sure the talks are over, but there's any way to get credit for, say that happens in the next cycle? Like say I think we went over like our low by like 50 units or something like that, but there's no way to recoup anything like that. I know that question came up when we were presenting to the commission, so I just wanted to kind of ask that.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, there's no quote-unquote rollover. Like there used to be rollover minutes when you had a plan with AT&T Singular back in the early 2000s. There's no such rollover at this point, but it has been something that's been proposed by the legislature, including our local representation here as well. Jurisdictions have been asking about that, and it's certainly a possibility that that would be the case going into the end of the sixth cycle. Any other questions? Yeah.
So on the table, and you have low income, you have moderate income, and so say for instance, if you exceeded this column.
Commissioner, if you can turn your microphone on.
Sorry about that. So on your table, when you have your low income, moderate income, all that information, and so say for instance, on one of the incomes, you've exceeded that column, I know at one time they were talking where you could roll it over to another column that needs the help, say for instance, moderate. So say for instance, on the affordable income, on the affordable housing, I've met and exceeded my expectation. And so can I move that excess amount over to the column where I need it, whichever column it is that I need?
Yes, that's a great question. So considering whether one income group can satisfy another income group, you can count up. So if you're exceeding the very lowest, extremely low income, very low income, the city's arena is currently 335. If you produce 335 extremely low income units, you'd satisfy your entire arena. If you permitted 335 market rate units, you would not be able to do that because you don't have the same affordability provisions. Thank you. Okay, moving to the next slide. Really just want to highlight the new programs. IP 2.3.3, as I mentioned, code changes. This is really in response to a number of the streamlining bills, a number of bills that have to do with the kind of housing that has to be allowed in certain zones, whether it's emergency shelters, low barrier navigation centers, certain provisions for streamlined applications for affordable housing, really all of the state mandates that the city has to comply with. Just having a plan within the next year or so to incorporate these into the city's code. I'll take your question, I'll get through these three programs and then take another question. So the next two, 4.1.4, limiting code enforcement actions for ADUs. This is really in response to rehabilitation, housing rehabilitation, and ensuring that in the spirit of affirmatively furthering fair housing, that the city's ADU policies aren't going out of their way, that the Code Enforcement Division isn't going out of its way to enforce the regulations around housing stock that may be perfectly safe. So ensuring that any code enforcement activity pertaining to unpermitted ADUs has to do with issues of health and safety exclusively, and this was in response to feedback from the council and our commission. And finally, the third new program, equitable representation, is an outreach program, really to ensure that the city is making a diligent effort to have a representative commissions, councils. This was identified in the survey of, and I'm going to get the name wrong, but the Homelessness Policy Advisory Board of the city that responded to a survey looking at the contributing factors to fair housing issues in Cloverdale. So this was one area in which community engagement necessitated a new program, and it's included in there as well. So now let's take questions on the programs. Commissioner Wagey?
Oh, the question I had was, what does AP stand for? What are these?
That's implementing program. So that's the general plan language for structuring the programs.
So we have the goals, which are the lofty, and then there's policies, and then the IP is the implementation strategy for each goal.
Okay, seeing no more questions. Next slide, please. So next we're going to look at the housing sites inventory. Next slide. So looking at the RENA allocation, you may notice this is a little bit larger than when you first saw these RENA numbers, and that had to do with the annexation from unincorporated county of Bumgardner Ranch, a large project that's included in the sites inventory. So this included a transfer of units from the County of Sonoma's allocation to the City of Cloverdale, bringing the total RENA, which was transferred proportionally from 278 to 335. The reason why this was done now, it had to be done at some point anyway, and it's much easier to do it at the beginning of the process than having to go back and get approval from the ABAG Executive Board, which has several months of lead time to get on their agendas. So that was facilitated to be able to include parcels that are going to be annexed into the city in the process of being annexed into the city in the RENA allocation. So in total, the 335 units, looking at pipeline projects, the line directly below RENA allocation, the city is meeting all of its RENA through pipeline projects with a decent buffer. Due to economic uncertainty, so I'll start off by just saying, generally, we recommend about a 30% buffer in each income category. Due to some economic uncertainty, most cities that I'm working with are tending to want to go a little bit higher with that, just so you don't get into a position where, due to new legislation, you get into a territory that's known as no net loss, where you essentially have to go back, revisit your site inventory. Your housing element can be deemed out of compliance if you lack sufficient sites to meet your RENA. So really wanting to make sure that there's a healthy buffer for the city to work with in case any of these projects don't come to fruition. In addition, I will just note, you may be noticing that there's no breakdown of extremely low income, very low income, low income. It's all just lower income for the purposes of RENA. This is because when you're validating sites for the ability to develop as affordable housing at low incomes, there's a handful of criteria, mostly having to do with size. It has to be between a half acre, it has to be larger than a half acre, has to be smaller than 10 acres, and it has to support the default density for affordable housing as determined for that region. For Sonoma County, with the exception of Santa Rosa, it's 20 dwelling units per acre. We've demonstrated that affordable housing has developed in Cloverdale at slightly lower densities, so that gives the city a little bit more flexibility. But essentially, that's what we're looking for in terms of sites and their ability to accommodate lower income. So when we
Luke,
look
just-
at housing, yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. Just for the benefit of the new commissioners, just the RENA is the number of units that the state believes that we're going to need in this next period while this plan is valid. And then within that number, they break it down into the various income categories: extremely low, low, moderate, and above moderate. So you'll see there. So just to make sure everyone knows, I know we have some new commissioners, so that's kind of what, when we're saying RENA, it's the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which is assigned to us from the state, and they say, okay, at the rate you're growing and what we see, these are the numbers that you need, these are the number of units that you need to, accommodate in the next cycle.
Over 8 years. Hey, a quick question, sorry to interject, but
That's great.
we talked a little bit about the Baumgartner project and that it's increasing the RENA number by 60 to 70 units to us. But out of the 300 units that are planning to be built at Baumgartner, how many of those can we count? Just that 60, 70, or do we get to count a certain percentage of it?
So you count the project as it's planned. So the increase in the RENA is not the same as the total number of units of the project, which are several hundred, as you note.
I was under the understanding that the county is counting some of those project numbers. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's because the project started in the county, and the county, I think, identified that site for some of their units.
Mm-hmm.
We have to basically share some of those units with the county.
Yeah. Can we pick which units we want first, like as in the low-income units, and count those towards our number, and then they get the remainder?
No, we had to do an agreement with them, and we went back and forth. I think we got a pretty good deal based on what their initial ask was, and it did go down considerably. Jane, I don't know if you want to chime in on that, but Chair, if that's,
Yeah,
it did change our arena.
it did change the RENA, but in exchange for changing the RENA, it means that the county does not count any of the units. So the city will be able to count all the units associated with the Baumgartner
perfect.
project or any future annexation.
We went out,
That's part of the
so we
RENA
went out,
agreement.
but we get to count them.
Yeah. No.
Moving on from that, going into ADUs and JADUs, This is based on projections over the average number of ADUs that have been permitted over the past 5 years, and that average is multiplied by 8. The income categories that are assumed are based on a regional survey that was conducted that this understands how ADUs are generally rented out and the rents that they're made available at. So those assumptions are made. A relatively small portion of the RENA, and the city will continue to, look into how ADUs are actually being permitted and make sure that these projections are accurate over the course of 8 years. But those are factored in as well, and the assumptions are relatively conservative. So when looking at all of that, in addition to housing sites where, because of the reasons we noted, all of those sites are really small. So none of them are lower income. Most of them are single-family units scattered throughout the city here and there for a total of 15 units. So overall, we're looking at a really healthy surplus in terms of the city's RENA and a good buffer in all income categories. Any questions before we move on? Okay, next slide. So this is looking at a map of pipeline projects. As you see, the market rate projects are noted in red, moderate income noted in orange, mixed income in peach, and lower income in yellow. Most of the development concentrated on the southern side of the city, but located throughout the city as well, with the Vista Oaks project, Alexander Valley Apartments, Alexander Valley Resort, Gardner Ranch, and Bidou Calais being the largest of them, with a couple of smaller projects scattered throughout as well. Any questions on this? Next slide. And so as I mentioned with the housing sites, this was 15 units. That's why it barely shows up on the map. Most of these are single-family homes. None of them met that half-acre requirement to be able to be included as affordable housing. But we didn't really need sites, given the large scale of the city's pipeline in meeting and exceeding the city's RENA. Next slide, please. So now we'll just really go into the next steps. As I mentioned, this is the first adoption hearing, which will be next going to the City Council, pending Planning Commission's recommendation of adoption tonight. Over the course of April and May, we'll submit it as soon as possible, probably the next day after the City Council hearing for 60-day review. That'll be wrapping up around June or July, at which time we really do anticipate certification. As I mentioned, this is one of the shortest letters we've seen. We're pretty confident that we've satisfied HCD's requests and they're working with us to get to certification as soon as possible. I will note as well that in the resolution that will go to City Council, there will be a portion of the resolution that indicates that non-substantive changes can be made by either the city manager or the assistant city manager, depending on what we decide. That really means that we'll be able to change matters that really aren't policy decisions. Things like adding additional analysis that HCD wants us to include in the technical background report, adding metrics and milestones, timelines to programs. Any of that kind of fine-tuning really would be what falls under non-substantive. And the purpose of that in the City Council adoption resolution is basically just so there isn't a tiny change that we have to make and then we have to go back to the Planning Commission and City Council and restart the process. We really want to get you to certification as soon as possible. But I also just want to assure you that those non-substantive changes aren't going to mean a new program. HCD wouldn't allow that. We wouldn't allow that. So really, this is the bulk of this is the document that you're going to see, and once you adopt it with confidence. So we're available for any questions, and thank you very much.
Are there any other questions about the housing element on the commission?
I do have a question.
You're on.
So once we've met the RENA numbers, I know that right now we're governed by laws because we need to meet the RENA numbers. But once the RENA numbers have been met, are there any laws that we don't have to be regulated by? Like, say, for instance, the density bonus law.
Yeah, so that is not the case with the density bonus law. However, there are certain provisions. Senate Bill 35 one that allows mixed income and affordable development that, as long as it complies with existing zoning standards, it can be approved if a jurisdiction isn't meeting its RENA. If you aren't meeting any of your lower income RENA, or if you're only meeting your lower income RENA, it can be approved at 50% affordability. If you aren't meeting your market rate RENA as well, then those projects can be approved at 10% affordability. And there's a bill that's currently in the legislature to extend those provisions. However, if you meet your RENA, then you're exempt from those provisions. The city is currently eligible for SB 35 projects at 10% affordability, but there are local jurisdictions, Incorporated County, Roanoke Park among them, that have become exempt from SB 35 over a course of meeting their RENA through the planning cycle. So those determinations are released every June. That's the main one I can think of, but there's a possibility that as further streamlining bills are added, and a lot of them are really modeled after SB 35, that provision will be included in those as well. But density bonus, that's one that, to my understanding, Government Code 65915 is amended all the time. It's hard to say what the density bonus law is going to be in a year, but to my knowledge at this time, adequate RENA progress isn't a way to become exempt from density bonus provisions.
Generally speaking, all of the new laws we've been talking about over the last year and a half, they would still apply even if we make our RENA. I mean, there's those small examples that Luke mentioned, but you know how we discussed reducing the parking for affordable housing and the density bonus and the things that they're entitled to by having a project that serves lower income, that would all still apply.
I think basically what you're asking is like that requirement still exists. Like, for example, the Asti Road project, we're still basically required to approve it even if we're meeting our RENA. Yeah, that's how I understood it, and that sounds like, yes, that's the case. We still have to.
Yeah, so like if, best case scenario, we meet all arena and we've got projects developed and built, if a, fifth or sixth or whatever came after all that and wanted to do the same thing with the density bonus like a Bumgarner, just because we met arena, we couldn't deny them that, ability. They're still able to apply for what's under the law, and that still would be applicable.
Any other questions from the commission? Not, I'll open it for public comment.
You Chair, there are no
Hold on,
members
we
of the
got one
public
question from
present,
staff.
and there are no members online raising their hand at this time.
Chair, just real quick, as part of the implementation of the housing element, there's several zoning ordinance amendments that we're going to have to go through. So you'll be, just as a heads up, you'll be seeing those coming, some quicker than others, some of them a little more time sensitive. So just a heads up, as we implement this, they're going to require us to do some, and you can see all of those in there under code, I think it's called code changes.
And I was going to ask about that because when you have nexus of proportionality, we can't require a contractor to go beyond what is proportional to their project's impact. So that's why if we look at the ordinance, there's a possibility that it has certain features. Are you doing anything with water, with recycling, as far as local ordinance and making it a mandate, or like, say, for instance, the recycled water, gray water, purple pipe for our community?
Well, Commissioner Sanders oftentimes brings that up, but where we're at with that is our treatment plant it's a secondary treatment plant. We need tertiary treatment in order to get the water that's clean enough to reuse in the purple pipe. So, we've applied for a grant to do a feasibility study to upgrade our sewer. It's a big, big project, and it's inevitable. The state's going to tell us probably in the next 8 years that we're going to have to upgrade it regardless. But we've, in the past, and you've witnessed that we've asked developers to put in the purple pipe, in advance of that treatment. So,
We're not required to, but we can still ask every developer to put it
Yeah,
in.
and if they have
Just get ahead of the plan, because the
Yeah,
plan's
and if
gonna
they have it
happen.
open, the trench open, it doesn't cost very much more to get the purple pipe in there. So we've been thinking about that, but we're a little ways out.
There's also a greater state plan about our water above us, which could influence our plan here.
Yeah, it's true.
Any other comments? If not, I'll go. So you said there's no public comment?
No, it looks like there are no members of the public online right now, unless Commissioner Sanders would like to speak as a member of the public, but not as a commissioner. You can raise your hand if you have that ability, since you are viewing the meeting, but other than that, no hands are raised.
Okay. With that, is that the completion of your presentation then?
That is.
No other comments, no other questions from the public? So then I'm looking for a motion to the Planning Commission to consider a proposed amendment and by resolution recommend that the City Council adopt the CEQA addendum in connection with the 2023 to 2031 housing element update and recommend adoption of the 2023 to 2031 housing element update to the City Council. Can I get a motion?
I'll move.
I'll second.
Can I get a roll call vote?
Thank you, Chair. That motion was moved by Commissioner Wiggy, seconded by Commissioner Spengler, and I will start in that order. Commissioner Wiggy,
Aye.
Commissioner Spengler,
Aye.
Commissioner Carney,
Aye.
Commissioner Hoverts,
Aye.
and Chair Acey.
Aye.
Motion passes. 5 ayes.
No other public hearing items listed. We'll move on to any new business. Is there any new business from the staff or from the commission? Seeing none, we'll move on to commissioner reports. Are there any reports from any of the commission? Anything to bring up of interest? Seeing none, we'll move on to department reports.
Thank you, Chair. Our next meeting is May 2nd. We'll likely have that meeting. We're working on the 6 acres water district. We have to do they're trying to annex in and get hooked onto water and sewer for the city. Yeah, so we'll be doing a pre-zoning for that. It may not be May, but it's coming. We don't have a lot of development proposals at this time, but I just want to let you know we are tentatively planning on May 20th a basketball court opening at Second Street Park, where we're going to have activities and food and just a whole bunch of fun stuff. So we'll remind you as that gets closer. That date may change, but I think we're settling on that date. At the next city council meeting, I'm going to be requesting that Commissioner Waggy get appointed again for an additional 4 years. He's up and he's volunteering seems like he's game for another go-round, so we'll be doing that at the council meeting. I think that's it. Do you have anything else? Or? Yeah. Oh, and yeah, we have some. Also, we have some zoning ordinance amendments that will be coming forward.
Yeah, I know we've been talking about that one for a little bit, but it's definitely happening next time. And it's kind of a housekeeping, wide range of things, but some of those, a few will be related to some of the housing changes that we need to do.
Any update on groundbreaking or anything with the Alexander Valley Apartments, Alexander Valley Resort, Baumgardner, or the 101 North?
Well, Baumgardner is out there doing site work. Alexander Valley Apartments is going for additional funding. I think they did not get funding in this round, but they're going for another round in this month. And what was the other one? The resort. David and I have been meeting with some interested groups in the resort. So we'll see. I don't want to be too optimistic or what, but they've been asking a lot of really good questions, and hopefully they'll pursue it.
And the 101 North project, the one that's right next to Papa's?
We've had some communication with them. I think they're getting ready to apply for a building permit. So, yeah.
Any questions from the commission about department reports? Any comment from the public regarding these reports?
Chair, there are no members of the public present, and online or in person.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. I was just curious, is there any update on Vista Oaks?
It's for sale. We've had a couple calls of inquiry, but that's pretty much all I have. I think there's tire kickers out there, but no one's really approached us serious about pursuing that project.
Is there any direction from the commission for staff for future agenda items? None. I will move to adjourn this meeting to our next regular meeting of the Planning Commission scheduled for May 2nd, 2023. And I'll adjourn this at 6:50. Beat 7 o'clock.